So, well, good evening. My name is Monica Grandison. I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Marietta-Cobb, and thank you for coming to Access Equity and the Power of the Ballot. We are very pleased to be able to work with SPLC for this event, and I am pleased to be able to introduce our speaker for today, Carlos Andino. He is a senior staff attorney with the Southern Poverty Law Center. He specializes in voting rights and democracy cases right here in our state of Georgia. Carlos has been a civil rights litigator for the past 5 years, working on a variety of cutting edge issues. Carlos has also graduated from the law school right here in Georgia, the Emory School of Law. So it's my pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Carlos as our speaker for today.
Thank you, Monica, and good evening, everybody. Excited to be here and excited to jump into this conversation with you all. A couple of just table setting before we get started. I'm going to have a slideshow presentation that I'm going to put up in a second. Feel free to follow along, but I'm also going to be speaking orally. So if you don't follow the slides, that's okay. On top of that, there is a Q&A function, so you can send messages directly to the panelists here. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to send them. We're going to have time at the end for Q&A, so you can also save your questions for then. If I can try to answer a question during this, I will try to, but otherwise I'm going to save all answers to questions to the end. Also, I'm aware that some of you have already sent questions to us, and we greatly appreciate that. I'm going to try to answer most, if not all, of those questions in the presentation. But if I don't get to your question at any point, feel free to ping us again and we'll get to it. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now. All right. And my panelists, you can see that? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Wonderful. All right, everyone. So we are here to talk about voting, right? And there's a number of things to talk about, hence the name of this event in general. But I named this slideshow just protecting the freedom to vote in Georgia, because generally speaking, everything that we're going to talk about today is about that fundamental right that you have to vote and what can be done to protect it and what potentially is being done to challenge that protection. Now, I have to say off the bat, right, this is a nonpartisan conversation, but it's community centered, and I try to be practical, right? I'm not going to try to bring up a whole bunch of legalese if I don't need to. But again, if anything comes up that you don't understand and you'd like me to break it down a little bit more, feel free to stop me or send a question, and we'll get to that with the time needed. So we have a packed agenda tonight. I'm going to talk ideally for no more than 40 minutes in this presentation, because I want to save time in this hour block that we have for your Q&As. But like I said, this is educational. This is to get you all informed about what's happening here in Georgia, what's happening on the federal level, and what your rights are already. Now, that being said, none of this conversation today is legal advice, right? I am a lawyer. I am licensed to practice law, but I'm not here to talk individually to people about their particular circumstances. I'm providing general education information. That being said, we want to provide support and help to everybody. So if you do have an individual legal question, if you need help, you need some advice, you can feel free to reach out to us after, and we'll make sure we'll get your resources so that you can reach out to us during that time. Generally speaking, though, we have a flow for today. We're going to talk about who and what the Southern Poverty Law Center is, and how we support and help people. We're going to talk about gerrymandering, because that's a hot button topic issue right now, all throughout the country. And we're going to talk about how gerrymandering impacts the right to vote. We're going to talk about what's happening on the federal landscape and on the state landscape, so you understand what's good, what's bad, what's happening with your voting rights. And then we're going to get into some specifics about the practicalities of voting, right? How do we support people who have language and accessibility needs when they go to vote? How do we support people who are justice impacted? How do we support people who may fall through the gaps of our voting rights and the protections that we have and the support systems that we have? So like I said, a packed agenda today. Feel free, ping me with your questions, and let's get to it. So first off, Southern Poverty Law Center, my employer. Southern Poverty Law Center has been around since for the last 70 years, actually. We've been around for a long time fighting for the rights of people impacted in the South in a multitude of ways. We came up fighting the KKK. That's what we're most known for, what we're famous for. And we continue to fight that extremist rhetoric and actions of people who want to push out people in poverty, push out people of color and different diverse backgrounds. But since our evolution, challenging the KKK, we do many, many different things. And first and foremost, based off today's conversation, we fight to strengthen democracy and people's voting rights, right? We challenge voter suppression. We try to help make sure that everybody has access to the ballot. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. That's my area of expertise here at Southern Poverty Law Center. Besides that, though, we, again, do a lot more. We fight against white supremacy and anti-democracy extremism. We fight to end unjust imprisonment and reduce harms related to the criminal legal system. And we want to help to eliminate poverty and give everybody economic opportunity in this country. In Georgia in specific, we have a state chapter that we have a team of people working on the policy side and on the legal side to make sure that all these areas that we work in, that we have goals in, are being pushed forward here in the state of Georgia. So you will see us at the state legislature. You will see us in community meetings. You will see us in the courthouse, and you will see us partnering with local organizations. And that's the most important part of this all, is that we are community focused and centered. We want to make sure that what we're doing, what we're fighting for, has been informed by those who are actually impacted and on the ground. So that community impact, that organization and partnership we get to do with you all is extremely important to us. And that's part of the reason why I love coming out and talking to community members. So just a quick 101, right, as far as voting, all right, and who has the right to vote, who can vote, just to make sure we're all on the same page as far as the basics, right? These are rhetorical questions, and you're going to see a number of rhetorical questions, by the way, in this presentation. I'm not expecting anybody to jump into the chat and answer these questions. These are just to allow you to engage, to get your thoughts flowing, maybe bring up questions for you that you want to ask us. So feel free to play around with those in your mind. But anyways, back to the basics here. Eligibility, right? Here in the United States, we try to have a wide range of individuals who can vote. That is anybody above the age of 18, right? As anybody who is a citizen, who has established residency in a state, right? Because you vote in your specific state, and those who are registered to vote. And that's a key element when we talk about any voting rights, any part of the voting rights process here, is that registration element. You need to, if you don't know already, I'm sure you do, but if you don't, you need to register where you live to vote so that you can get assigned a precinct in a voting district, and so that your vote can matter not only for the national, federal elections that we have, but also for those important local elections, so that you vote for your specific council member, your specific city member, whoever it may be, your superintendent. We want to make sure that you can get all of those. Now, there was sometimes confusion out there as far as what disqualifies an individual. And to be honest, there's not much that disqualifies individuals to vote. The main ones are you move, therefore you're no longer eligible to vote where you used to vote. That just means you got to register wherever you are now. The next is you revoke, give up in any way your citizenship. This is extremely rare. You have to go through a long, arduous process to give up your citizenship. So I don't think that's going to be applicable today. But that's one of the ways that you can lose your right to vote. And then the other way, we're going to talk about this later, but if you're currently serving a felony sentence and you're incarcerated, is another way that individuals oftentimes become temporarily disqualified. And we'll talk about when you get past that disqualification. So here in Georgia, there's a number of ways to vote. We have, for the time being at least, early voting in person. We have absentee by mail, and we have voting on election day at your precinct. So you can get ahead of the game by voting early, either by mail or in person, or you can just wait till election day. Now, there are a number of rules on voting in Georgia, what you need to bring, your registration card, for example. But those are changing. We're going to talk about how those are changing, how they potentially may change, what IDs may be necessary in the future. But in any case, that's just something generally speaking that you got to pay attention to is what are you required to bring. And then importantly for today, we're going to talk about whose votes count and do all votes count equally. Under the United States Constitution, all votes are supposed to count equally. Everybody is supposed to have equal access to the ballot and have their voice considered. Unfortunately, that is not always the case, and we're going to talk about how that happens through gerrymandering primarily today. But in any case, I want to make sure everybody has a good habit when it comes to voting, which is for every election, check your registration. Here in Georgia, you can go on My Voter page, and you can make sure that you are registered to vote and where you're registered to vote. This is important because sometimes people get purged from voting records. This happens, for example, when people haven't voted for a couple of elections. The state may purge you from the voting records, and therefore you need to resubmit your voter registration. We want to make sure that doesn't happen, especially on the eve of an election. So it's always good to be in the habit, I usually say 90 days out from an election, ideally, to go ahead, check your registration so that if there's any issues, if the state is wrong, made a mistake at any point, you can get that fixed. So let's talk about the scary thing happening right now in our country, gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is very typical, actually. I say it's scary, but it happens every 10 years in every state. It happens usually because of the census. And the reason that it happens is because voting populations change, right? Cities grow, counties shrink, whatever it may be. And again, the idea here is that we want to make sure everybody's votes are equal. They count the same. So we don't want certain districts that are overpopulated, and we don't want districts that are underpopulated. Either of those issues can lead to somebody's vote being counted too much or too little. And again, putting people on unequal grounds, unequal power scales. So the goal, ideally, with redistricting or gerrymandering every year or every 10 years is to make sure things balance out. Now, the thing with gerrymandering is that there is leeway, right? The elected officials of your state, your county, depending on the election, are the individuals who get to decide what priorities to focus on with gerrymandering. Maybe they care about partisanship. Maybe they want to make sure they win the next election. So they're going to make sure they draw the districts that give them the best advantage possible. Maybe they care about communities of interest. Maybe a certain community in the past has been discriminated against, and they want to make sure that community is put on even footing. Maybe they care about metro lines or highways and people's access to the ballots to make sure everybody can get to their precinct or their voting site. Gerrymandering in itself doesn't have to be bad. The problem is that in our history as a country, we have allowed bad influences, bad categories to impact gerrymandering. And two ways that pops up most frequently is partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. And in case you don't know, right, like I said, this is done at the local and state level. This isn't done at the federal level. So it's your elected representatives at the state legislature and your counties that are making these decisions on the districts. So with that in mind, your representatives, like I said, may want to get an advantage. They may want to make sure that they can politically win as many seats as possible. This can happen in a number of ways, but typically it occurs by them trying to create what's called safe seats. They look at voting habits of individuals, and they try to put as many people with similar voting habits in the same box together, the same voting district, so that those votes are collected, that they're disaggregate, and therefore more likely to vote for the party or individual that they want to win, the people drawing the lines. Now, this can lead to people's districts being cracked. This can lead to people's districts being stacked. And we're going to talk about what those look like visually. But this purports, right, how people exist in their communities. You might live in a district that is made up of a whole bunch of like-minded people, or you might get shoved into a district that doesn't have a whole lot of like-minded people, a whole bunch of people that don't look like you, in order to dilute that group's vote, right? Now, unfortunately, with this partisan gerrymandering, the federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court in particular, says that judges have nothing to do with partisan gerrymandering. It is not the jobs of federal courts to interrupt or interfere with partisan gerrymandering, which is wrong on many different ways. But that's what the courts have said. They said the discretion of partisan gerrymandering is up to the legislatures, up to the states, up to the counties. That being said, there are still a number of protections for you all, despite partisan gerrymandering being allowed. And we're going to talk about that first and foremost in the context of racial gerrymandering. It is illegal under the United States Constitution, under the Voting Rights Act, and several other laws here in this country, including state laws, to discriminate on the basis of race, nationality, national origin, and so forth. That means that it should not be taken into consideration what your race is when you're drawn and put into a specific district. What that means is that what has happened historically, where individuals in Black communities have been cracked or split up to reduce their voting power, should be illegal. And that's what we primarily do in the voting rights sections at the Southern Poverty Law Center, is we find where legislatures, counties, so forth, have split Black communities, brown communities, minority communities in ways to dilute their voting power. And we tell the court, and we often win, that this is illegal, this is unconstitutional for many reasons. Right now, we have a case down in Houston County, Georgia, alleging exactly that the racial minority there, the Black community, has been underpopulated and diluted based on the voting scheme in Houston County. So this unfortunately happens, but there are mechanisms to fight it. There's also a number of other laws, but importantly as well is the one person, one vote right that we all have. This means that your vote is supposed to be on par or equal with other people's votes. So even if you're put into a community that doesn't look like you, your vote is still supposed to count the same because the populations throughout the state, throughout the different districts are equal. This is a real focus though on population, right? It's not about your identity. It's not about the way you vote. It's about everybody is supposed to be put into voting districts that are equal in population so that your vote matters the same as everybody else's. That only fixes some of the problem, right? That's only part of the problem, but it's an important protection and a limitation on what legislatures can do with gerrymandering. Now, with that all said, I've kind of talked about the federal landscape. On the local level, there's a number of things that states can do to make you even more protected, to make your rights even more entrenched. And often this is done with local legislation, local charters, local commissions, local constitutions that say, beyond what the feds have done, we want to make sure everybody has the right to live in a compact district, a contiguous district. These are technical legal terms. We don't need to get into them. The important thing is that localities hold a lot of power here. The feds set the floor. The states can go even further. And that's why it's important, right, to speak, to communicate, to educate, to inform each other about what your local legislature can do to better protect your rights. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So just to give you a quick visual on how gerrymandering hurts communities, these are the most common ways that we see it: packing and cracking. Packing, as I mentioned before, is the example where you put a whole bunch of like-minded people, a whole bunch of people who are going to vote the same way into a single district. This can either work one of two ways. That means, one, that district is a guaranteed vote for whoever the legislature wants, right? That means if we want a Democrat, we want a Republican, we put all the Republicans, all the Democrats, all the people of one party there so that we know what the outcome will be, or we have a pretty good idea of what the outcome will be. This also works in the inverse, though, right? In that if you have a very diverse community and you want to focus in on diluting the number of total representatives that can get into the legislature, that can get into Congress, you put all the like-minded people into their own districts so that the overall state, right, focuses more on the other party. So what that means is that if you have a place like Atlanta tends to vote a certain way. Instead of mixing up the population of Atlanta throughout multiple districts, you put all the people in Atlanta in the same districts so that you minimize the number of seats that party can win, if that makes sense. Now, on the cracking side is you're doing the opposite, right? You have a really powerful voting block. You know it's going to lead to a certain outcome, and you want to split that voting block up, right? You have one party that dominates in this certain community. You know that they're going to win if they stay together. So you split them up into multiple districts to make sure they always make up a minority. Now, we see cracking a lot when it comes to racial gerrymandering, right? We see Black communities in particular being cracked into 3, 4 oddly shaped districts to make sure that their votes don't count as much or don't have as much power as the other votes in those districts. And this is part of what we allege, for example, in our Houston County case, is that the Black community there has been mixed up in a certain voting scheme that their vote to elect candidates of minority races will never be able to overcome the white vote in the county. And you see this, unfortunately, still to this day. It's a trend of the Jim Crow era, but it's something that legally we can fight and something that we often fight. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on gerrymandering. Want to focus more on your questions that may come up. But before we move on, just a little bit more about how lines are drawn. I talked a little bit earlier about some of the things that are generally taken into consideration, some things that are written into laws, especially local laws, for legislatures to keep in mind. Those include things like equal population. That's that one person, one vote that I was talking about earlier. Contiguity is making sure that your shape is connected, right? We don't want a whole bunch of islands of people voting that actually don't live together in a cohesive district. We want to try to respect community subdivisions, communities of interest, political subdivisions. I already talked about those, but those are often debated, right? There's a lot of conversation of how do you define a community of interest? And some people, unfortunately, try to distort that, try to make that work in their favor. And then there's the Voting Rights Act and our other federal legislation related to voting rights, right? Whether it's disability related, returning citizens, and so forth. They have to comply with these federal laws. They got to make sure they don't discriminate on protected basis. And that's what comes into play when drawing these lines as well. So as community members, you have lots of leverage points. You can go when these lines are being drawn to public hearings. You can submit written comments. You can support local narratives about what is a community of interest where you live. Is it the schools? Is it the people? Is it the transit? Is it a language, right? To make sure that your voice is heard and these things are taken into account when legislatures are drawing lines. And then there's always outside work, right? Experts, people who do analysis, lawyers like me who can come in and advocate and fight for you and say something is wrong. And again, while partisan gerrymandering is not something that can be litigated, oftentimes when we see partisan gerrymandering, they're really using something else like race or some other protected characteristic to dilute a certain population. So even if they're saying this is for us to win votes for a certain party, that doesn't mean that there aren't legal options still. and we might be able to help you out with that. So let's talk a little bit about what the current legal landscape looks like. There's a number of federal laws that are currently providing voting rights protections. They've been around typically for 20, 30, 40, 60 years. They haven't changed, but they are up for potential changes. They are up for challenges in the courts. Right now, first and most notably is the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, as I talked about earlier, is a strong tool when it comes to combating racial gerrymandering. Unfortunately, there have been attacks over the last 2 decades on the Voting Rights Act, and the Supreme Court has weakened the Voting Rights Act, making it easier for lines to be drawn in ways that are discriminatory. Right now, there's a very important Supreme Court case that may limit the Voting Rights Act even more. So we're keeping an eye out on that. But until something happens, until the Supreme Court potentially puts out a bad decision, we are still using this law. It is an important law. It helps us combat racial gerrymandering, as well with the U.S. Constitution, which also prohibits racial discrimination. For individuals who may be voting with disabilities, we have a number of laws as well. Section 202, as well as HAVA and the ADA, all provide requirements when voting locally as to what must be provided. Individuals who need assistance reading, for example, can get that assistance that they need. People who need help getting in with a service animal, getting in with a wheelchair, voting by mail. There's a number of requirements under these laws of what local counties and precincts must do to support individuals voting under these circumstances. We're going to talk a little bit more later about those who vote with a disability and how best they can exercise their right, but these are important laws to keep in mind as well. Now, on the state level, there's a number of bills that have been introduced last year and going into this year that could impact the right to vote. Some of these also have already been passed and are struggling to be implemented, we'll say. First to note is a bill that has not been passed yet, but the state legislature, and this is something that the federal government has been pushing as well, is considering whether to push towards hand-marked and hand-counted ballots. Now, you may remember before the last election that this is something that the State Board of Election here in Georgia tried to require. And there was a court that shot that down, saying essentially it was ridiculous and impractical for a last-minute change to require all ballots be counted by hand. Despite that court's opinion, the efforts are still going on, and there could be legislation in the future that makes that change. So this is going to impact people by requiring the ballots to be potentially handed in person or sent by a certain date, postmarked by a certain date. There's a number of ways that this could impact folks and their right to vote. It's also going to slow things down, right? And we're not going to get election results as quickly. So this is something to keep in mind. There's also a bill right now that aims to prohibit foreign nationals from engaging in certain types of elections. Right now, especially in elections that are focused on ballot initiatives. And there's legislation pending that's being considered that would prohibit an individual not only from engaging in the actual voting process for ballot initiatives, but also would stop them from engaging in campaigning, i.e. giving money towards ballot initiatives, volunteering towards ballot initiatives, knocking on doors and encouraging people. There's a number of ways that foreign nationals would be prohibited, and it would be a criminal penalty from engaging in this type of activity. So this is a bill we're keeping close eyes on as well. And then some of you all may know that there's a number of efforts by the federal government to get voter information out of the state. Recently, the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice, sued Fulton County and the state of Georgia asking for voting records. In Fulton County, they want voting records related to the 2020 election. And on the state level, they want voting records related to anybody registered to vote. Now, they're claiming that they need to gain this information or gain access to this information for the purposes of fighting voter fraud and dealing with any discrepancies in the recent elections. Now, as you all know, all the courts that have litigated over potential fraud or anything that would impact the results of the 2020 election have found that none of the allegations have been able to hold legal water. But that doesn't stop people from continuing to fish and dive into this area. This is important because not only will they get access to information about who voted, but they'll get access to information about social security numbers, addresses, and other personal identifiable information. And this, in our opinions, and we're litigating about this right now, is a huge privacy violation and risk of privacy breaches for individuals who have voted. And we fear that this is going to lead to people being less encouraged to go and register to vote because their information is going to be accessible by the federal government. So this is something that's keen and aware that this has been something that has been developing over the last 30 days. And we don't know how the courts are going to rule on this, how it's going to shape up, but it's something that's directly impacting voters right now in Georgia. Now, with that in mind, it all comes back to making sure that you all are aware of how to vote and how to make sure that your vote counts. We already talked about voter registration, which is the first hurdle that you have to overcome. But when it comes to coming to election day, it's important to keep in mind, right, that certain rules are required for you to show up and be able to vote. For example, Georgia is a state that requires photo IDs for in-person voting. Not every state requires for you to come with an ID, but Georgia does. So you want to make sure that you have an ID. And this is something also that's potentially going to change in the near future. Georgia is considering passing a law that would require for you to show up with a real ID or a passport in order to vote. Those who are supporting such legislation believe that those methods of identification are more secure than the broader category of IDs that are currently accepted. So that's something to keep in mind and pay attention to in the future is the list of documentation that's going to be accepted for a photo ID going to change in the future? Or is it going to be what has been accepted for a long time now? It's also important to keep in mind, right, that since you can early vote, since you can vote by mail, there's certain deadlines that you have to keep in mind. Votes right now in Georgia need to be postmarked by the election day, right? That means that you need to try to turn in your ballots early if you voted by mail or absentee so that your vote can be counted the day of the election. If your mail is postmarked after the election, then the state may not count it. And this is important because the United States Postal Service has recently changed some of its guidance on how mailing is postmarked. In the past, it was not always clear when it was postmarked. And now it's being clarified by the U.S. Postal Service that only when your mail is actually processed by the postal office is it going to be postmarked. That means your mail could be sitting in a box. It could be sitting in the postal office for a day or two, and it actually hasn't been postmarked yet because it hasn't been processed. So you want to build in some additional buffer when you vote to make sure that when it gets processed, it's still before election day so that it gets postmarked properly and it can actually be counted in the election. You can also always have the option of when you drop off your ballot or drop off mail in general to go to the post office and ask them to postmark it right there in front of you to make sure that you get the day of postmarking and make sure that your vote's going to count on time. But this is important to keep in mind because otherwise your ballot may go in and it may not count. There's also some changes happening right now related to QR codes. People may remember if they voted in person recently that QR codes were on Georgia ballots. This was something to help you get checked in to the ballot, make sure your ballot counted. But recently there was a law that said that the QR codes need to be removed. The problem is that there's no funding for this law, though. So a lot of counties are struggling to implement this law, and it's unclear in 2026 with the upcoming elections how this is actually going to play out. Whether all the counties are going to get rid of QR codes, whether some of them are going to have QR codes, and it's going to be a bit of a mess. So something to keep in mind. There's also potential ending of no excuse absentee voting, and there's active litigation going on about several other Georgia specific challenges. I don't want to get in them all today because I'm realizing I'm coming up on 40 minutes pretty quick, but I'm happy to answer questions. The important thing out of this is that you check that you're registered, right? You go to election websites that are trusted to get information about what is required when you go to the election site, or when you vote by mail, or when you pick up your ballot, and so forth. And then as legislation changes, as court cases get developed, you're staying up to date. You're continuing to check those trusted sources so that you're aware of any changes that may impact your right to vote. All right. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly, just so everyone's aware, because like I said, I realize time is moving fast. So let's talk about language access at the polls, right? This is an important tool, and it's important information for people who may be voting with some challenges with language. Now, the key point here is that you still follow the same plan when you go to vote, right? You still confirm your registration. You still decide how you're going to vote, whether that's by mail, absentee, in person. And you keep in mind any of those key deadlines that are coming up for your vote. That being said, if you need help at the poll, if you need help submitting your ballot, you have a right to that help. And you can designate an individual to provide you that help. You can designate somebody to say, I want my family member, my neighbor, whoever it may be, to come with me and help me with casting my ballots. Now, if you show up and you try to exercise this right, you try to say, I want this individual to help me, and somebody tries to stop you or somebody seems confused, ask for the poll manager at the site. Ask to have that poll manager resolve the situation. If for some reason they're not willing or they're not able to fix the situation and allow you to cast your vote with that individual helping you, ask and request a provisional ballot so that you can have your vote recorded, and then the issue can be resolved and fixed later so that your vote is counted, right? And provisional ballots, especially here in Georgia, are such an essential tool. If you ever have a difficulty casting your ballot and you want to make sure your vote is still written down and can be counted until an issue is resolved, you want to request and submit that provisional ballot. Now, this is an important tool for people who may have disabilities such as blindness or the inability to read, dyslexia, things like this. And again, these individuals that you assign to help you can help you understand the information in front of you. Now, there are some limitations on who that individual could be. It can't be your employer. It can't be a person who represents a union. This is just because we don't want to encourage people to influence your vote, right? We want to make sure that vote is yours and yours alone. Plus, I don't know about you. I wouldn't want my boss with me in my polling site. But the important thing here is that your polling site, your ballot, it has to be accessible, right? People have to be able to cast their vote and do so privately, even if they need somebody helping them. So it's important that if you need this right, that you exercise it, that you make a plan, and you make sure it works for you day of. I keep repeating this stuff because it's just so important to make sure everybody casts their vote, right? But you want to make sure you're reading all this information ahead of time. Make sure you register to vote. You make sure you know where to go. Make sure what hours they're open. You're bringing whatever ID or identification that you need to bring. If you need the requested accessibility needs, you're requesting those at the polling site with the polling manager if need be. right? You're there to problem solve with the polling manager. And if you can't problem solve, you're getting that provisional ballot to make sure your vote is at least recorded ahead of time. As community members, you can help by informing people of these rights, making sure they're aware of them, making sure that they know that they need to make a plan before going to the polling site. You can also help by spreading information through voting kits. We see this in several states where hotlines are created through certain organizations. Materials are translated, especially here in Georgia with so many diverse populations. We have organizations all throughout the state who are translating into a variety of languages, Korean, Arabic. I mean, the list is, especially in a big city like Atlanta, the list is very long as to the languages. So you want to make sure that if you need those services, or if you can help support those services, you're out there identifying them ahead of election day. We see a lot of organizations also with bilingual volunteers, people who help people before they go to the ballot boxes, either by practicing what to do on election day or going with them on election day to make sure that they're supported come their votes. Sorry, I'm going to go through this so fast, but we definitely wanted to talk about people who are justice impacted, returning citizens, and so forth. As I mentioned before, if you are incarcerated and you're serving a felony, your right to vote may have temporarily been disqualified. But it's important to understand this is only while you are serving your felony sentence. Now, serving a felony sentence can be while you're incarcerated in jail. It could be while you're on probation. It could be while you're on parole. All right. But as soon as you're done serving that felony sentence, you can vote again. All right. And usually this is automatic, right? You don't have to go through any special process to restore your right typically, but you must re-register to vote. All right. You most likely have been taken off the voting polls. You've been purged. And you need to make sure that ahead of election day, ahead of the deadlines of election day, you get out there and you register to vote. But again, other than that, typically speaking, you have the right to vote and there should be no additional steps that you need to do. Now, this is important to note because a lot of people get confused. They may be waiting for a trial. They may be in pre-detention. They might be serving a sentence for a misdemeanor, right? But just because those things are happening in your life doesn't mean you can't vote. It only matters if you're serving a felony sentence. So if you're in jail, i.e., you haven't been sentenced to a felony or you're serving a misdemeanor sentence, you can still vote. You still have access to that. And you can still receive an absentee. Now, there are certain requirements, and I'm not going to get into all those today about how to prove your identity while you're incarcerated. But there are a number of organizations who provide support and services to help people while they're incarcerated with the right to vote. And you can reach out to us and we can provide those resources or to other individuals. We have a guide on our website specifically dedicated to this topic that you can go ahead also and read and educate other people on about how to vote despite being impacted, justice impacted. I'm going to skip this one because we already talked about it, but that's talking about the process after your return from a felony sentence. Again, if you have questions, we can talk about that. There's also a resource on our website at Southern Poverty Law Center. So lastly, I just want to talk about gaps, right? Where people fall through, because in this country, we don't have 100% voting participation. We sometimes struggle to even get 50%, right? We have had less than 50% participation in this country. So it's important to understand who falls through the cracks in the voting rights and getting their ability to exercise their vote. Right now, the census estimates that about 3/4 of Americans are registered to vote. That means a quarter of us don't even have the ability to vote yet because we haven't registered. And then even with those who are registered, about 10% of that population, 10% less of that population actually goes out and votes, at least in the most recent election. And then People who vote differ sharply by their age, their race, their ethnicity. As you may know, most commonly, the people who vote at the highest rates are older, white, educated Americans. All right, these are the people who turn out in the highest numbers, percentage-wise. But it doesn't have to be that way, right? Unfortunately, people of certain racial groups tend to show up in lower numbers, especially if they're, you know, barriers to them getting out to the polls, depending on where they live, depending if they have a language access issue that they need resolved, depending on whether they have a disability that needs to be addressed at the polling site. There are barriers to voting. And our job, what we try to do at Southern Poverty Law Center, is to try to reduce those barriers as much as possible. But they still exist, right? And we want to keep trying to fight to reduce them. We want to raise turnout for all groups and make sure that everybody who has the right and the ability to vote in Georgia can do so, especially here in Georgia, where we see, despite populations growing in size, like the Latinx population or the Black population in certain parts of the state, those communities continue to struggle to get out to vote. And we want to make sure we provide them support, tools, and resources that allow them to vote. So when it comes to closing the gap on voting and making sure people can turn out if they want to turn out, there's a number of things that we try to do and that people can do, right? For example, year-round engagement. Election day is not really one day. It's all year long, making sure people will get motivated and educated on how to vote and when to vote and what might be required for them to vote. It's making sure that everybody in our communities have trusted messengers, people that they can go to for information to say, yeah, my aunt told me you need to be registered by this day. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to vote. Or your ballot needs to get in the mail by this day and so forth. You know, we want to remove the barriers and the friction in people's lives that stops them from voting. That might be offering people a ride. Getting to polling places can be challenging. Atlanta traffic, you all know, right? It's terrible. People might not want to sit in it on their own. People might not have the car to sit in it. MARTA doesn't go everywhere, right? And we want to make sure that people can get to the polls, and it might be helpful to offer people to help in that way. I already talked about language and disabilities, but there's a number of organizations and resources focused on those too that help people get out. And then young voters, right? This is one of the groups that has the lowest turnout rates. You know, we want to make sure that they're supported in all parts of their life, their workplace, their colleges, online, to get the information that they need to get out to vote and cast their ballot. So some trusted resources, we can share these later, but there's a number of websites that you can go to, places that you can go to get information about your right to vote. These are some of them. I'm not going to run through them right now because I've talked for too long as it is. But you know, there are so many trusted resources out there. And if you ever have questions about which ones to trust and which ones to disregard, you can always reach out to us. So that's going to end my presentation. I hope that you all have enjoyed this, and now we can get into a bit of a discussion. So if you have questions, concerns, issues, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we're going to pay attention to them. And I see Monica's come off mute, so I'm going to give her a chance.
Well, thank you so much, Carlos. That has been a plethora of information, but we will go into the Q&A session just right now. I have a few questions that were sent previously, as well as some in the chat. So let's get started with the very first questions. What voting-related laws or policies are being debated during this year's Georgia legislative session, and how might they affect voter access and turnout?
Yeah, so I've already talked a little bit about these laws, right? Laws that are going to change how your ballot counts when it gets to the ballot to the mail-in place, right? Laws that are going to change which IDs are accepted at the voting place. Laws that are going to make your information when you vote more accessible to other people, like the federal government, or you know, God forbid, data breaches, right? Because of information being shared. The state legislature in Georgia is very active, especially when it comes to voting rights. That's part of the example with the removal of the QR codes, right, that they believe is a security risk. It's important, and I've already talked about some of them, so I'm not going to talk about them more, but it's important to stay up to date on these and know that there's also going to be litigation related to a lot of these. So just because something may pass the legislature doesn't mean it's automatically becoming law. And if you have concerns about what's coming through your legislature, what gets passed at the state assembly, like I mentioned before, there's organizations like Southern Poverty Law Center who are fighting at the state legislature, who are fighting in court, who can help you exercise your rights and make sure your vote remains protected. But yeah, there's a lot of laws being considered here in Georgia.
Thanks for that. We just asked for some clarification. One of the questions was, doesn't the ballot in Georgia have to be received by the end of election business day and not just talking about provisional? Can you provide some more explanation towards that?
Yeah, so I think you're thinking about something that's been proposed, and this is something that we're seeing in litigation right now in multiple states in the country, is that some specifically Republican legislative members are claiming that a ballot needs to be received by election day in order to count. In Georgia and in many states, that's not currently the law. It needs to be postmarked. That may change. That is, if I'm going to be honest, that is likely to change in the near future, but at the moment, it's not currently the law. So I'm hopeful that that clarifies that.
The next question is, how do you see the current situation nationwide impacting Georgia elections, especially those related to voter privacy and our voting data?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot happening at the national level. For example, I see one person talking about the SAVE Act, right, which is being considered by Congress right now, which may impact Georgia. These lawsuits brought by the Department of Justice are going to impact Georgia voters by the information being shared. I think there's a number of ways that this is going to impact Georgia in particular, right? One, for example, is that we have a lot of people of different national origins in Georgia, especially in Atlanta, right? And part of the thing that we're seeing being said by government officials, by the federal government, is that they want access to voter information in order to determine people's immigration status, right? And to identify whether people are here illegally or if they're voting illegally or whatever rhetoric that may be being pushed out by current people in government. So you're going to see, right, them continue to try to get access to voter information here in Georgia because Georgia is a swing state and it matters so much. And then that information is going to be used potentially for a bunch of different purposes outside of just voting. And it puts people at risk, not only from federal prosecution or having their rights exposed, right, or infringed upon, but also their information getting out to untrustworthy sources. We just had some reporting in the national level about non-government workers getting access to Social Security numbers because of efforts from certain agencies like DOJ. And it's a concern of ours that if they get access to voting information, we're going to keep seeing these data breaches and people's privacy rights being violated. So Georgia is going to be a very important state for all of this, and we got to keep an eye out.
Another question that says, like, how can we be sure that the post office will send our ballots to the right process to count and know that the people that don't open it up and discard it? I often tell people not to use absentee ballots.
So it's
Is
illegal.
there a process? Mhm.
Yeah, it's illegal for somebody to interfere with your ballot, right? The post office is not supposed to open your ballot. That is a sealed document. It's a legal document. I believe, if I remember correctly, it is a felony for anybody to interfere with that ballot, including the postal workers. So as far as the process, right, there's already legal protections in place when you mail in your ballot. That being said, if that doesn't feel comfortable to you, right, you can drop off your ballot to a polling site as well, right? You don't have to mail it. You can, when there's early voting going on, you can fill out your ballot and go drop it off still. And that way that you feel that nobody is interfering with it beforehand. But if you do fear that your right to vote has been infringed upon, somebody has opened your ballot, messed with it in some sort of way, you can report it. You can go to the State Board of Elections, or you can go to local law enforcement, and they're supposed to take legal action to make sure that your right is protected. And if you think something widespread is happening, right, this postal office is opening everyone's ballots. You can reach out to people like us, and we can look into it and potentially bring litigation over that as well.
And we're just going to end with one more question. Looks like it says, what happens now that the DOJ has sued Fulton County? Will they be forced to turn over voter files? Have any other states been countersued?
Yeah, so we're fighting with Fulton County to try to stop your information, or not your information, but for those of you who live in Fulton, if anybody does here, try to stop DOJ from getting access to that information. It is not set in stone that the judge in that case is going to agree with DOJ. I'm a former DOJ employee myself. I can tell you from experience, we lose all the time at DOJ. And we hope that they lose here. So we're going to fight to make sure that your information is protected. Fulton County is doing a good job as well of fighting. And there can be limitations. Even if they get access to some information, they don't have to get access to all the information, right? So we're going to be fighting in every way that we can to protect people as much as possible.
Looks like I have a time for one more question. Do you have to go to Congress days to facilitate citizens going to Congress to express concerns with REPD? REPD.
So I don't quite understand that
I
question.
don't. We'll come back to that. Let me do the other one. Doesn't Georgia have tracking or absentee ballots online?
Yes, Georgia does have that. I know I've heard reporting, right, depending on the county that you live in. For example, more rural counties, that tracking can't always be great or accurate. You have to keep in mind that voting is funded locally. So that means your county needs to be the one who's putting in the money to make sure the resources work. We actually just published a piece on this on our website about how certain counties, certain precincts aren't adequately funded. For example, when you go on voting day, at least this last election, you had to sign in with an iPad, right? And the election officials have iPads. A lot of those iPads break. A lot of those iPads don't connect to Wi-Fi. If they want to fix or use those iPads, they need to pay for it, and counties don't have money for it. So one thing that Georgia can do is give more money to the counties, to the precincts, so that they can pay for this stuff and make sure that tracking, for example, is done properly. But that is a big issue.
Well, thank you, Carlos, for your presentation today. I want to let everyone know that we're not just done with SPLC at all. We have a live presentation that we are preparing for March 2026. So please watch your emails and notifications from the League of Women Voter Marietta-Cobb County. You're going to want to come to this meeting. We're going to not just do a presentation, we're going to provide something to eat as well. So you're to come in, and first we're going to give a 15-minute presentation. We're going to start over with gerrymandering and present the former and current school board map. So you're going to want to be there for that. Then we're going to go over and talk about the Cobb County versus the Cobb County versus Finn case, and the outcomes and the impacts on the 2026 election. Then we're going to have a former school board member come and discuss the role of the school board and the importance of turning out to vote in 2026 and to vote in our local election. And then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So please continue to watch our social media pages for any upcoming updates. We're very excited to be working with SPLC on this year. They have been a fabulous partner with us. So on behalf of League of Women Voters, Marietta County, as well as Carlos Andino, thank you also to Nadiv. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight. Please watch out for your email. There will be a link following this presentation in the next couple of days, so that you can come back and rewatch our presentation from tonight. Thank you and have a good night.